After we've covered our piece with the butter cut, I've then drawn out the pattern. You can see here on the bird, sort of the rough drawing of it, a little more filled in, and then sections that I've cut out that we will eventually sandblast through to remove the black glass and show the blue glass that we had underneath. But I'm going to set this one off to the side, and I will demonstrate sort of how I do the patterning and cut it out onto just this quick, simple template. So I've covered this with butter cut. I always take duct tape and put it around the edges or over the edge of where my piece is. So wherever I don't want to be sandblasted, I want to make sure I cover. If I'm doing a flat piece, I may cover the back with newspaper and then use duct tape or masking tape depending on how close it is to where I'm blasting. But I don't want to use duct tape for my resist when I'm sandblasting if I want a clean edge, because it's a fibrous resist, fibrous tape, and that will start to fray and break down and you won't have a clean line. Now for certain things that may work, but for what I'm doing with my work, I don't want it. So what I do when I'm setting this up is I can draw on this butter cut. It works really nice, and what I like to do is use a few different colored pencils and markers so that I can start to build up my pattern. I can start with this orange, and I can start to just rough out how I want my pattern to be. I'm not super tight with it. I'm kind of loose, just working quickly. And it just gives me a starting point that I can go back in, and I can start to figure out how that's going to look. Okay, so there. Then, once I get that, I can start to come with a different one that might be a little bit darker. And start to clean those edges and those lines a little bit more, so I'm a little more defined with where I'm at on them. And I have it a little more drawn out. And then, oftentimes, once I get through a couple of those, I have my rough plan of where I want it to be. Then I'll come in and I'll do it even dark with an even darker thing, usually a pencil, and start to think about where, well in this case, where it's going to interact with itself, and how I'm going to end up getting that to lay out just the way I want it to. But again, this helps me to start to darken in and lay out my pattern. Now, at this point, I like to use, dry erase just because I have a bunch, but I'll use a green one, and in this scenario, I might go, if I want it to be just that thickness, then I can use the actual thickness of the marker to start to lay out and follow that line so I have a nice clean pattern with which to cut and follow. So now I've got my form or my pattern predominantly roughed out there, and I can come back in with either a Sharpie or a black pen, and I can really start to set that edge as well as the thickness of what I'm going to cut. And that way I know and follow my pattern much more cleanly, and it's exactly the layout I want it to be. I've been able to go back in, rough it out, and really start to set it so that exactly what I want to have on there is there, and I can follow that pattern easily, and I'm not wasting a huge amount of time trying to figure out how to do it. So at that point I can go back in. Now, when I'm drawing it out, I might run into mistakes, and when I do that, what I do is I use Goo Gone. Any type of remover works pretty well, but I'll just dampen the corner of a cloth, and I can come over and just lightly rub and erase my drawing on there. Even the parts I've gone over a few times, I can come back and it erases right off. The big thing at this point though is I don't want to immediately go back in and start to redraw. I'll wipe that off. I want to let that sit for a few minutes because what that does is the Goo Gone makes this a little tacky and a little softer. So if I come back and I try to draw onto it, you see the ink doesn't show up as well, but it also pushes in a little bit. And if I'm doing this a few times, it's going to start to break down that butter cut, and I'm not going to get what I want. But if I let it sit for a while, now I come back, it's really easy. You can see I can draw on it without having those same issues. When I'm cutting with my X-Acto knife, I want to make sure that I keep that blade straight up and down. If I cut at an angle, I'm going to have an angled or shaped line there, and if I want to have a nice clean straight line, then I want to make sure that I keep that blade in a nice straight line up and down. It gives me more control over it, and I find that I have a much cleaner cut and a much more precise shape with what I'm doing. I can just peel it right out. Now, when I'm done with something, I will always go back in and double check my lines, make sure they're clean, make sure they're where I want them to be. If I needed to come back then and clean up, I can always do so. But I want to do all of this before I sandblast into it, as I don't want to start sandblasting and then go back and have to recut a line, because I won't have a clean edge on my pattern then. When I'm sandblasting, I'll have my hands inside here, and I'll be using my nozzle or my gun. I would like to stay about 6 inches or so away from my piece. The closer I get to it, the more sort of overspray I get. But I like to stay back about 6 inches to get a nice even spray. I also want to try and stay in a clean line up and down. If I sandblast at an angle like this, it's going to cut at an angle, which means if I'm coming at an angle across into this pattern, I'm going to end up cutting underneath my resist, which is not what I want to do. So if I want a nice clean straight line, I sandblast in a nice straight clean line. Now, I'll go through this and I'm going to turn it on and sandblast, but I won't be talking during that because you won't hear me over the sandblaster. So every so often I like to be able to take a look at it. So I'll stop, I'll let my sandblaster catch back up. And I'll take a look, and as you can see, we're through the black. Oftentimes I'll just take a damp cloth and wet it a little bit and kind of rub in there so I can see the pattern, see if I'm at any points needing to go back through and get an edge better. But this looks nice and clean, and that's how we do the tail. You can see now where the sandblasted part is. The black obviously having been removed. I've wet it. I wouldn't go back in and try and sandblast again because I've peeled this back, but you can see now we've got that nice shiny black with the blue matte.